everyone, and welcome back to another industry report. It's a fairly interesting one today because CD Projekt Red have announced mandatory crunch leading up to the November 17th release of Cyberpunk 2077. Now, the context there is that many people working at the studio have already been pulling overtime for months or years already in this project, but this formal call for a 6-day work week does break a lot of CD Projekt Red's direct promises that they made publicly and to staff. They in fact made those public statements last year about not being pro-crunch and trying to make things better, such that they could be called up on their past words. Well, it now seems that that's something that's going to be happening. Now, CD Projekt Red has supposedly been taking steps to limit crunch and to treat employees with respect, but we do have to wonder, how has that actually been working out when we're now in a situation where, yeah, it's a mandatory crunch, and there's actually surprisingly a lot to talk about when we dive into this and what it means for Cyberpunk and generally CD Projekt Red and the industry. Let's begin with the full story. So, CD Projekt Red have ordered mandatory 6-day work weeks ahead of the game's November release. That's the, as they say, here's the quote, typical amount of work and 1 day of the weekend. Now, according to the email sent to staff, the studio head says that he's optimistic about the game and that it's actually been sent for certification with the console platforms, but that it is time to fix the lingering bugs that are in it. Something that seemingly they've been doing for, a year at this stage? Now, the email also does say the studio is, as they put it, in overdrive. And we can only imagine what this looks like because we've heard about what it's like at Rockstar and Treyarch and so many other developers. You know, it's the sort of thing where there's a version of that that's extremely nasty. What it probably is everyone working late into the night. You've probably got some people sleeping at their desks. You've probably got the producers and the managers ordering in pizzas and beer for the staff to try to provide some moral support. And I mean, that's something we've heard happens at Naughty Dog as an example. So it's probably that thing where the staff are now in this situation and they probably are going to try to make it as good as they can for themselves. But what many people would say is it's the fact that they're being put in that position that is the problem. Now, Badowski admits that this is something that has went, against what CD Projekt Red have previously said about crunch and what he grew to personally believe. Now, in the email, he says that he's ready to, quote, receive the full backlash for this decision. And apparently it was the studio's last resort. I will say, if he's making it very clear that he is the fall guy, this was a decision that was in large part his, and he's trying to take maximum responsibility for that, and that certainly is a good thing. But still, what happened. Now, this entire thing broke, of course, via Jason Schreier. Now, Jason's one of his particular journalistic interests is, workplace treatment, unionization, stuff like that. So it's no surprise that he is the guy who's looking into this, especially since even when he had his tenure at Kotaku, it did seem like he had decent sources at this company. Now, he added that some of his sources are claiming that some staff have been putting in nights and weekends for over a year on this project. Now, most of the focus in his story is, of course, on the apparent change in attitude from CD Projekt Red since they announced last year that they would be avoiding mandatory crunch, and now they're doing just that. So yes, they made promises, and then when push came to shove, they were not willing to keep those promises, and a lot of that makes you think, why? Why is it so dire that they can't do another delay or anything like that? Why is it that it seems to essentially be November, do or die? To be honest with you for that, we don't know 100% sure, but we can make some guesses. I mean, as an example, CDP Group is the overall, the overall group. In terms of market cap, they, at one point, they may still be now, were larger than Ubisoft. So in terms of the financial markets and all of those pressures, because they are a publicly traded company, there may indeed be an immense amount of pressure for them to get it out, perhaps in this quarter. Perhaps there's the case where, in terms of the backroom dealings and what happens when the studio heads talk with the top of corporate there, well, maybe there are just some situations that we are not privy to that mean that they're basically like, nah, You can't do it in 2021. That's it. I mean, we can think of a few things. There's perhaps wanting to hit the next-gen console release. Maybe they have some sort of, commitments that they've made with their partners that they don't want to renege on. Maybe some contracts that have got a collateral. It's really hard to say exactly, but suffice to say, there is clearly some reason why they are no longer willing to delay. And I would also say there's probably some form of reason why, in spite of the many delays we've already had, it keeps on slipping. And for that, well, we'll talk in a bit. But first, broken promises. On two separate occasions last year, CD Projekt Red's Marcin Nowinski said that they would not force overtime, and that's obviously what's being called up here. Now, it would be an option, and CD Projekt Red might ask for crunch, but it would not be mandatory. That was his point. And the goal there was, and this is his words, to be more humane and to treat devs with the same level of respect they treat players. Now, obviously, players, we love CD Projekt Red for how well they treat us, right? How incredible their games are, how they actually are reasonably priced, I would say, and they have DLC that's really good, no microtransactions. We can all agree we love that stuff. It just right now is a bit of a situation where on the game front, the output front, they are sometimes feeling like this solitary beacon of hope in AAA. But then you look at what happens with the developers and you start to see that, well, a lot of the bad sides of AAA development practices are still happening at that company. Now, the idea was, when Marcin was talking previously, that developers could take the time off when needed and they wouldn't be frowned upon for doing so. So if you said no to crunch, like it didn't work for you or your family or whatever, that you wouldn't really have any form of penalty at the studio. Because, of course, a lot of people are worried about actual and social penalties if they don't sign up to crunch like an 80-hour work week. So they made, commitments that would not happen. Now, they told Kotaku this stuff in May of 2019. This was actually ahead of E3, and it was following Kotaku's investigations into Rockstar and into BioWare. So CD Projekt Red probably wanted to get out ahead of some form of story that was brewing there. I mean, Jason notes receiving news of the studio's turbulent development with this game, so he's probably been privy to a lot. There's stuff like, say, working through Polish holidays and studio-mandated vacation times. I mean, that thing of mandated vacation times, I really, really hate that. That's... I just don't like that stuff. Now, this is stuff that was essentially confirmed by managers, according to Jason, and there were apparently hundreds of parallels between Anthem and Cyberpunk 2077. Now, you might be worried when you hear that. I actually do think that Cyberpunk is going to be an incredible game and not like Anthem. I think those hundreds of parallels probably go down to the fact that this is a game that's been in development for an extremely long amount of time. It's probably had many different design changes and maybe some issues in terms of direction and stuff like that I'd say have now probably been hammered out for the most part. I think one of the differences there is, they're just going to have a better end product, but it is just that thing where, in the same way Anthem had a bunch of bugs, Cyberpunk right now probably has a bunch of bugs. I'd imagine those are the parallels, and of course, some of the situations staff actually have to go through to get the thing to ship. Now, in May, one specific manager promise was that the final hours of Cyberpunk 2077 would be less crunchy than those for The Witcher 3, and The Witcher 3 was fairly legendary in what its crunch was like. And at that time, it was said that the April 2020 release date was chosen to not make it a ginormous burden for the team. So fast forward then to January 2020, and that's when the cracks were beginning to actually show publicly, and where the game, of course, was delayed from April to September. Now, at around, I think it was slightly later than that, they did tell investors that the dev team were required to put in crunch hours to some degree, and that despite efforts to limit crunch, some was necessary for the final stage. But still at that point, it was a bit more in line with, look, it might happen, but it's optional and you won't be judged. So that was the September delay. Of course, it was then delayed again to November, 2 more months, and it seems like 2 pretty damn rough months. And now that they've announced that they're breaking their promise, well, Badowski was on the defensive pretty damn quickly. And I'd say, it's the sort of thing that won't convince people, but certainly it will play to their base very well. So not long after Jason broke the story, he tweeted in response. And the response was basically saying, we're doing it all because we care. And he was really blowing the passion whistle while reiterating that it's one of the hardest decisions that he has ever had to make. Certainly, yes, that does seem like that would be a hard decision. Now, he also ends by saying that the team are well compensated for every extra hour, as according to Polish labor law, of course. Now, let's actually break into that. So the team get bonuses. 10% of annual profit is split among them. That's something that I love. It's something we do at our company. And yeah, I'm totally pro that in general. So I think that's pretty sweet. Now, of course, there's also that we'll get into the exact amounts of overtime pay because the scaling is actually pretty interesting with Polish law. But basically, throwing more compensation at the problem is good and should happen. And it's just the sort of thing where that's a bit of a band-aid on the problem. The problem still does exist, right? The need for crunch is the ultimate problem. And consumers, here's the thing, consumers don't see the sort of cost of this because they still get their game for however much money. But the thing is, consumers don't see, say, another timeline where 5 years ago the team was at a better scale and the management was good, such that the crunch wouldn't be needed. In that timeline, the game is probably having more content and more features and stuff like that. So the thing there is, crunch will get a game over the line. Consumers can enjoy that game. The thing is, they'll never know what they're missing out on because they never saw the version of that game that didn't require a whole bunch of crunch. I think that's kind of the situation here. Now, for some staff, this increased pay will be a decent fit. I certainly know that when I was younger, if it was said to me, hey, you're going to have this big old, 150% for nights, 200% for weekends, or something like that, pay scale, young me would jump into that. But for a lot of people, that's not going to be a good thing. And it being mandatory, I think, is the real problem here. So, with all that said, just how bad is the crunch situation at CD Projekt Red? Well, let's get into it. So, the now mandatory overtime amounts to 6 extra days in the 6 weeks up until release. So, it is 6 more days of work, and, you're 8-9 hours for a work day. The thing is will it actually be 8 or 9 hours? Personally, I suspect that for a lot of staff, it will just be more like a 48-hour work week, but there will be key people who will be doing pretty insane work weeks. Now, this is not a huge amount of time, and it could perhaps be expected given the gravity of the game. An extra 6 days of work is a bit grim, but not massive, but that's only if it's considered in isolation. If they're saying the studio is going into overdrive, and we essentially know there's been crunch for months/years on this game, then it's probably going to be more than just weekends, right? Like, we're probably up to 60 to 80-hour work weeks for most of the staff at this stage. And then when you get onto some of the QA staff and key engineers, that's a problem, right? You sometimes get the key engineers and they just know the entire code base like the back of their hand, and they're kind of in a situation where they're the key person to fix a problem. So for those people, the hours can get really, really intense. I mean, even in terms of local stories, I've heard, key engineers pulling 120-hour work weeks to, get a crunch in for a deadline. And it's real rough stuff. And I've seen the cost of that on people, with my own 2 eyes. While the extra hours don't seem to be mandatory, I think we're all going to know how it's going to feel. Everyone's doing 6-day work weeks, and you don't want to be the one who leaves your team out to dry, right? So you're going to put yourself into the same trenches out of obligation to them socially. And I think this is the kind of passion that the industry often, I think brazenly, exploits. We've seen that at Blizzard with their low pay. We've seen it at Naughty Dog as well. And unfortunately, as much as I love the things that they make, and I love some of the just banterous nature of them as a group, but CDPR seems to be a bit guilty of the same thing happening. I mean, if you're working on the most hyped game of the last few years, yeah, you're absolutely going to put yourself through hell to actually live up to that. Now, if this is a small indie, right, and it's, that kind of story of you're sleeping in the office, you're doing all those indie dev things, you're eating ramen, whatever, if that's like, a team of founders and it's a small situation, I can sort of get that happening. But I think that the excuses for things like that rapidly go away when you have far more capital, you can plan for multiple years in advance, and you should be able to headhunt top management talent to actually run your company. So it's the sort of thing where it's up to management to ensure that this is not necessary, and then the culture to not support that. And that's the problem here. And as we've seen time and time again, relying on passion and crunch is not a sustainable thing. It results in experienced and trained employees leaving for better industries. I mean, you can just go into tech and earn a lot more if you're an engineer. That's basically how it is. So many engineers choose to be in games with their skill set because, well, yeah, the money's not as good as some other thing, but they're passionate about it, and that's kind of the tricky thing. And I think really what's important to note here as well is that this is not unpaid overtime, and you should be aware that unpaid overtime is actually a problem in the industry as well. Now, Polish labor laws do not permit unpaid overtime, and CD Projekt Red's rate is 150% for nights and 200% for weekends. So if you think about it, if it's 6-day work week, one of those is paid at 200%. I wonder what it's like if it's a weekend night rate. Is there one there? Are they additive? Are they multiplicative? Probably not. But certainly there'll be some staff who will be really happy with the amount of beans they can pull in this period of time. And it might actually be able to work for their personal financial goals or something like that, especially if it's only for a few weeks. But the thing is, here's the key thing, it doesn't excuse it being mandatory. That's the thing. There's a bit of me that sort of thinks, well, look, if it's in line with local labor laws and there can be a voluntary agreement, between a worker and a company, sure. But the thing there is, that could be really fine in principle, but it can be just a little bit messy in practice, because then the whole thing of, well, Joe over there is putting in 100 hours a week, and, if I am only here doing 40, I'm going to feel bad, so I think I'm going to put in more hours as well. And then, you lead to that cascading problem. And you also lead to the problem where if you kind of do that for key staff, then you're massively over leveraging your key talent. You're going to burn them out. You're going to lose them. That's one thing that'll happen. And also, you make them so damn essential to the project when you're the entire thing hinges on them doing 120 hours a week, that you just open yourself up for loads of cascading risk factors. What if that person has a mental break, but they're actually a key engineer in your project? I mean, that stuff you got to think about when you're doing management and stuff like this. So yeah, requiring it to be mandatory to actually get a project to be finished is really a massive failure in their whole situation. Then, of course, there's also contractors. How are they covered by Polish labor law? I don't know, but we should think about that. Now, labor laws are interesting. I mean, there's stuff I've seen be going on in the UK industry that certainly doesn't seem like it could fly in Poland. I mean, I know a company that for all of the cuddly sort of virtue signaling stuff that they project, well, they do all that, and then in their employment contracts, they have mandatory unpaid crunch, like actually contracted in. So I don't even know if that's legally enforceable here, and it certainly doesn't seem like it would fly in Poland, but you should be aware that stuff like that actually goes on quite a bit, and it's pretty rough. But yeah, it does seem like a lot of, that sort of player-first integrity stuff that's really good. It does seem like right now the cost of that is being paid on the developers' end. Now, one way you could look at this for CD Projekt Red is, they are so player-first and they're so good to us because the developers are bearing all of this load and, they're absolute heroes and all that stuff. I would say, actually, if the staff are actually making it through this, then damn, they are like absolute beasts, absolute heroes, sure. But I would say that it's not the case that the player-first approach has to be paid for or is paid for by developers crunching and stuff like that. I do not think that is true. CD Projekt Red, they make incredible games, and they are able to use their outsized to their revenue or to their costs financial success to pretty much fund what they want, right? And that means they should be able to have the time to actually do these things right. Certainly, if you look at the gap between Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk 2077, they do have the time to just sit back and do things right. So the things are slipping like this. I don't think that's good. What I would personally say here is I think they do mean the best, but I think that because they're so willing to spend such a long amount of time in their games, I think that means they don't have a tight feedback loop on their management practices. I think that means that deadlines and dates can just slip and slip and slip and slip until the cumulative slippage of multiple years of not having the most watertight management practices then means that they're in a situation now where seemingly they can't move their date and they just have to say, hello, entire team, you all need to work for a very long time now. Bit rough. There's also the fact that crunch is wasteful as hell, right? It's not really the way you want to do things. Now, they said to investors in January that the game had been complete and playable for a couple of months, and that it needed polishing and playtesting. And that is what the April to September delay was actually for. So if that's what that was for, I mean, what was the last delay in this crunch about? Were they really where they said they were, or did they, keep on just finding reasons that the game was truly not in a shippable state? Or did they end up with more content and things just creeping in? I mean, it's clear that they were either too ambitious with the project or they were extremely off with their project management, which then, of course, results in them now having too few staff to get the job done within a 40-hour work week. And the thing there is that paying your existing staff overtime rates at, 100% or 200% more, and that makes it much more expensive per man hour than just scaling up your team size. And of course, the more you do that, the more you actually decrease the efficiency of the hours spent. So it just makes the entire thing like slower and more expensive over time. Now, there is a reason why they can't just rapidly scale a project up. I think anybody who's moved on to a new code base, be it university, be it work, will know what this is like, because it takes an employee months to get up to speed on a project, right? And the getting new people up to speed will take time away from the existing employees who would have to be doing the onboarding. And I therefore think that just scaling the team up to fix a bunch of bugs whenever you know the bugs are a problem is not really a viable option. I mean, bug fixing, that's going to require a lot of knowledge of the code base, how things are made, how quests are tied together, all of that stuff. And to teach a new employee that super quickly, I don't think that's going to be able to happen in the timescales that they're dealing with. Of course, that's bad management, and it should have been thought of a whole bunch earlier, but that seemingly is where we're at. But the point here is that the onus is absolutely in them to do a better job of managing their teams and their expectations for their games. And ultimately here, if they do that, then the consumer wins, because the games come out in a more smooth process. And probably, I think the timeline of the next CD Projekt Red game that doesn't have a bunch of crunch and a bunch of problems, I think in that timeline, that game probably has more content and features because the whole process has been smoother and more efficient. I mean, to contrast this with a recent example, and I should mention this is a programmer and also a union rep, so it's somebody who will be very pro all of these things, of course, but they're from Paradox, and they replied to Jason's news saying that Crusader Kings 3 was shipped with no crunch and was the best game they ever made. Was it? Yeah, look at the review scores. So this stuff can work, and it absolutely should work. As I said, a timeline where CD Projekt Red can do that will probably mean that the games will be better. Now it's time that we're a little bit into it for the more aggro part of the video, and this is just, corporate defense force people. So even if CD Projekt Red are putting on a good face here about being player-friendly and all that stuff, the fact is that the developers are carrying most of the weight here, not the organization, right? They're still making decisions that cause harm to their staff in the name of getting the game out, right, in the most profitable time of the year. And the thing there is that, of course, the game would be better if it didn't have to have all of this crunch going on and it was better managed. CD Projekt Red are in a position where they now have fans actively attacking Jason Schreier for, revealing that they are privately breaking public promises about the humane treatment of devs. And that's not me saying humane in some sort of sensationalized way. That's using CD Projekt Red's own words from 2019. Words that they said they spoke such that they could be used against them in the future by their staff if they went against their promise. And they did. And that is what has happened. But frankly here, people are just shilling like crazy for CD Projekt Red, just because they made The Witcher, which is absolutely great. But that's not much different from defending the practices of, say, Activision, Blizzard, because you like World of Warcraft. Look, our other channel is one of the largest World of Warcraft channels on YouTube. And believe me, whenever we're calling out Blizzard for doing moronic stuff in World of Warcraft, which don't want to get into that, but man, talk about a team that just makes everything overcomplicated and a bit silly and doesn't really seem to understand their players, at least from a systems design level. But, we call out those things, and what do we have? The corporate defense force slipping into the comments, just treating their reverence for Blizzard Entertainment, a unit of Activision Blizzard, as if it was some sort of fucking religious cult. Which is weird. That is short-sighted. It's bloody stupid. Companies and corporations are not your friends, right? The people who are replacing, I don't know, it's like they're replacing, what is it, like religion and community and culture stuff with like superheroes that are actually the intellectual property of a big corporation that's owned by Disney, and Disney themselves, I mean, damn, they're a bit rough. It's like all this stuff is absolutely crazy, and it's quite funny that also this is a Cyberpunk game and it would have a few things to say about all of this. So even if they are consumer friendly, we need to hold them to the same standards as everyone else out there, right? That's only fair, and we got to be fair. This industry can't exist without both developers and customers, so we need to be roughly on the same page for all of this stuff, especially because we as customers don't see the hidden costs of this. We don't see the brain drain directly. We don't see the games that could have been if they didn't have to rely on crunch and how much better they would be. keep that in mind. So to close this one off, basically, it's pretty damn striking that they walked back in a very significant, a significant promise they made publicly to all of their staff. It definitely speaks of problems with, with the situation, with the game, right? I would imagine there that it's a really in-depth, really complex RPG. It's one that I cannot wait to jump into, but that probably means that you fix one bug here and it's like whack-a-mole and 7 more appear over there. And probably they thought they were in for a far more easy game of whack-a-mole than they've actually ended up getting, and that's why they're now in this situation. And then, who knows, when they talk to their board, the highest levels of corporate, why is it that they're not able to delay this game? Is it because they want to hit next-gen release? Is it because they want to hit that, Christmas launch window? I mean, seemingly in the past they were okay to not hit that, so why is that changed now? Pretty tricky to say. A rough situation. Let me know what you think, and it's just that thing. I would advocate that we're able to hold multiple viewpoints. It is possible to be critical of the management practices of CD Projekt Red, to be very positive and respectful and excited by, their developers and how good they are, and to really like their business practices, right? It is possible to have all of these opinions be harbored at the same time. Not everything is a package deal where, it's like you're this block of opinions or that block of opinions. And often it kind of seems like it ends up being that way in practice when you look at the commentary that goes on online, which is kind of frustrating and actually is part of the reason why we decided to start this channel. So there you go. That's it for me. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think, and I will see you next time.